Hey guys, it's JR, your friendly neighborhood historian back yet again, this time for another tier list. I'm pissed off. And the reason why is because the last video I uploaded, which was the first I've ever uploaded, was struck down for not conforming to community guidelines. Now, I did eventually get it reinstated back on YouTube after I appealed the decision a few times. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Justice Clarence Thomas ended up finding in my favor, thankfully. But the whole situation and the fact that it was even struck down to begin with has made me mad and has made me want to double down. So if you thought that ranking German field marshals was a contentious and controversial thing to do, well, get ready, because I'm about ready right now to review some early war fighters of World War II, okay? And I know what you're thinking, JR, that sounds terrible. I have lost friends talking about such controversial topics. And I know, it's fighters have destroyed my own family as well. The disagreements that we have about the Supermarine Spitfire and the Macchi MC-202 are taboo topics in my own family and things that have cost me friendships. But if we want to become better people, we have to talk about tough stuff like this. Okay, so as you can see here, we have our tier list here. We have our normal S, A, B, C, and F tiers, S being the best, of course. But we also have JR's Hall of Fame here at the top. And I'm going to put planes in here, which I am personally too emotionally invested in to rank properly. And then down here at the bottom, we, of course, have the tier Too Ugly to Take to Prom. These are planes that are so ugly, it is sinful. And we cannot even rate them based on their performance. We have to rate them based on their aesthetics alone, okay? This is an egalitarian, family-friendly channel, but there are some things that, that just must be said, okay? All right, so without further ado, we are going to start with the Mitsubishi A6M2 Zero, as the Allies called it. And this is an easy S rank. It was the most advanced carrier fighter at the beginning of World War II. And it was remarkable because even though it was carrier-based, it was more than capable of competing against the very best land-based aircraft, which no one thought possible at the time, because operating off the deck of a carrier creates a lot of constraints onto how an airplane's design. It was not thought possible at the beginning of the war that you could create a plane, a fighter, for carriers that would be just as good as land-based aircraft. Well, the Japanese came up with a way to do just that, and the A6M2 was remarkable. It had great armament, great maneuverability. It had very good climb. It is an iconic aircraft for a reason. The one thing it had going against it was very lightly armored. So if you got behind this thing, put a few bullets into it, it was going to become a ball of flame very quickly. But even with that being said, it's an S tier. All right, next up, we have the Messerschmitt family, the E, F, and G variants right here. We're going to put the F variant at the very front because the F is normally considered kind of the pinnacle of the Messerschmitt family, or the BF-109 series. So that's going to be ahead of the E and the G. The F and the G were later variants of the BF-109E, which was the standard fighter of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, when the war broke out in 1939. This is, again, another iconic plane. Saying that you like World War II airplanes, but you don't like the Messerschmitt, or you're interested in military aviation history, but not interested in the Messerschmitt, that's like saying you like grunge music, but you don't like Nirvana, or you like modern cinema, but you don't like Martin Scorsese or Quentin Tarantino. You know, it's against almost the institution itself. Okay. And the Messerschmitt Bf-109, by all accounts, was a delight to fly. It had superb handling. There were a lot of very advanced technical details in the aircraft in terms of the controls and the hydraulics that were very advanced for the time. The only thing that this plane had going against it was the undercarriage. It had a very flimsy undercarriage. 1 out of every 10 Messerschmitts that were lost during the course of the war were on takeoffs and landings. So it really ended up affecting the plane and costing a lot of German pilots their lives. So that is the one drawback to the Messerschmitt. But other than that, it's an iconic aircraft for a reason. It's going to go in the S tier. Okay, our next plane, the Messerschmitt Bf-110, the fat cousin of the Bf-109, that is going to go into the C tier. This was a terrible plane. And the reason why was because the Germans had a theory before World War II that they could create this heavy fighter that would have very long range, that could escort bombers. It could keep up with the single-engined fighters, and it would also be used in a variety of other tasks like dive bombing and reconnaissance. But that did not end up working in practice. This thing was not able to keep up with the very best single-engine fighters, and most of the time you were just a target in this thing. It did serve as a night fighter during World War II with some success, but the main reason the Germans even used it as a night fighter to begin with was because it couldn't compete during the daytime, during the 9 to 5 business hours, okay? So that's going in C tier. All right, next up we have the Bloch MB-150, our first French fighter, and we're just going to review all the French fighters at once while we're here because there's not a lot of good things to say for the most part. So we're going to put the Bloch up there, and we're also going to put the MS-406 in C tier. We'll put the MS-406 at the top of C tier because this had decent handling, but still, both of these planes were underpowered. The one French fighter of World War II that was somewhat decent was the Dewoitine. Dewoitine was decent. It wasn't great, but it was at least decent and could do decently well against the Messerschmitt Bf-109E. And it had some good performance when the Germans invaded in 1940. So that's going to go in B tier. This plane was definitely better than these French fighters. Another French plane that we'll review while we're at it is the Potez 630. This was a twin-engine fighter that was very similar to the Messerschmitt, but even more underpowered, and therefore was even less able to hold its own. So this is going to go in the F tier. All right, next up, the Brewster Buffalo, our very first American plane. And this plane, as you can tell by its pudgy design, is going to go in the too ugly to take to prom tier. This thing is the kind of plane that you did not want to come home to. If you were fighting all day in World War II and you came back home to a Brewster Buffalo, you would just think to yourself, what am I doing this for? So we can't rank this because the aesthetics alone force it to be put in this tier. All right, next up we have the F4F Wildcat. That is going to go into the B tier, okay? This plane didn't have the best flight characteristics, but it was tough. It was a sturdy, thoroughly American kind of plane. This thing was a tank. It could take a licking and keep on ticking. And so it's going to go in B tier, mostly just because of that, just because of how well it protected the pilot, and it was a decent plane. Of course, its main opponent in the early days of World War II was the A6M2 did not have as good a performance as the Zero, and it was outmatched, but the Americans developed certain tactics to make the most out of the Wildcat, like the thatch weave, which was very successful in combating the Zero's advantages. So that's going to go in B tier, classic American plane. Okay, next up we have some Italian fighters, the Fiat CR-42. That's going to go in F. As you can see, it's a biplane, reminiscent of something you would see from World War I. And indeed, this plane would have done well in World War I, but unfortunately, that was 20 years already in the history books. And by the time World War II rolled around, this thing had neither the horsepower or the firepower to handle the big boys. Okay, now the Fiat G50. We're going to put this thing in C tier, somewhat better than the CR-42, but still not able to hold its own against the very best Allied aircraft. Now, our only Dutch fighter of the tier list, the Fokker, we are going to put this thing actually in the too ugly to take to prom. It looks a little bit better than the Brewster Buffalo, but as you can tell, this snub nose does it no favors. It has this really disgusting landing gear that was unretractable. So we're going to put that in the too ugly to take to prom tier. All right, next up, we have the Focke-Wulf FW190, and this is going to be our next S tier plane. And I'm going to put this ahead of the Messerschmitt and the Zero because this plane was possibly the best fighter of the Second World War. Kurt Tank was the designer, and he specifically wanted to make a plane that was a workhorse. If the Bf-109 was a racehorse, this was a workhorse. This was a plane that, unlike the Bf-109 that had some problems with takeoff and landing was a little bit harder to maintenance, this plane was made for the battlefield. This thing was made for tough working conditions. It had a extremely good performance that was comparable to the Messerschmitt, but on top of that, did not have the same takeoff and landing problems. It had better landing gear, and it was more sturdy. So this was an excellent plane that I cannot say enough good things about. And I'm going to shut up right now while I'm ahead. Okay, next up, we have the Gloster Gladiator. This is going to be the first plane that I put in my Hall of Fame. And this is a plane that if I was going to rank purely logically without emotions, I'd probably put in the F tier. It was a bad plane. But this plane is an icon of World War II. This plane, it goes beyond just the physical realm to the spiritual. During the defense of Malta, there's this very famous, almost like a World War II fairy tale, you could say, that at one point, during the combined siege of Malta by both the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica, the Italian Air Force, the air defense of Malta had been reduced to just 3 Gloster Gladiators. And according to the tale, according to the legends of old, these fighters were named Faith, Hope, and Charity. And for a few weeks, they were the only fighters that the Maltese had to combat the combined assault of the Axis powers. And they held the line. There are so many accounts of the Italians and the Germans thinking they had shot one or all of them down. And then the next day, there they would be again, rising to meet them. So it's a pretty sick tale. And of course, the pilots that flew this plane were tremendously successful in their romantic liaisons that they had for the rest of their lives as a result. So this plane goes in the Hall of Fame. Okay, next up we have the Hawker Hurricane. And this is another plane that, again, I am too emotionally invested in to rank properly. It's my favorite British fighter of World War II. It's one of my favorite fighters in history, period. This plane held the line. It was the most prolific British fighter at the beginning of World War II. It accounted for 60% of all German casualties during the Battle of Britain, okay? And even after it wasn't doing its best work as a fighter and had been eclipsed by other better aircraft, it did excellent service as a fighter bomber, as a night fighter, and in other ways throughout World War II. And it was tough. Its pilots loved it because they knew that if they handled it well, it would bring them home in one piece. This is going in the Hall of Fame. Okay, next up we have the I-16. The I-16, as you can see, the I stands for eyesore because this thing was also too ugly to take to prom or anywhere, even to your local bar. Okay, next one. We have the IAR-80. This is our only Romanian plane of World War II that we're going to be ranking. And we're going to put this in a B tier. It was a solid plane, which considering that Romanian industry was quite lackluster is really saying something. It means that with what little they had, they really put together something that was quite decent, okay? So this plane, it didn't have the best speed, but it was very maneuverable. It handled well, and it was dependable. And honestly, for the Romanian industry, that was really something. It did quite well during World War II. We're going to put that in the B tier. Okay, next up, we have our first Japanese Army plane, the Ki-27. We are going to put this in C tier. The main reason why is it was underpowered. This was more of like a 1930s plane rather than a 1940s plane. And it also didn't have the armament. It had only 2 small caliber machine guns. This thing did not have the ability to knock anything really heavy or really any type of sturdy monoplane out of the sky. And now we have the Ki-43, a more advanced Japanese Army airplane. This is going to go in the B tier. It was definitely better than the Ki-27, and it had decent speed, excellent maneuverability. But like most Japanese planes, it had no armor, no protection for the pilot. And on top of this, it also didn't have good armament. This also only had 2 small caliber machine guns. So the only way that this thing was going to shoot down an F-4F Wildcat is if the pilot was blessed by God, perhaps, or was extremely lucky. So it's going to go in the B tier, mostly for armament, but it was very maneuverable and possessed some really nice handling characteristics. Okay, now we have the Ki-44. This is going to go into A tier. This had more firepower than the Ki-44 and had a very different design philosophy. The Ki-43 was designed to be very maneuverable and to handle well. The Ki-44 was designed for speed. And one very important thing that you need to know is that in World War II, it was discovered that speed was much more essential for a fighter aircraft than maneuverability. During the dogfights of World War I involving hundreds of airplanes, zooming around and trying to get in behind each other for the kill, a lot of pilots had decided that maneuverability was preferable to speed because it enabled you to get positional advantages on your opponent. But in World War II, thanks to more powerful engines, it was quickly discovered that if your fighter was faster than the other, any positional advantage could be negated by just simply running away. If you had the faster plane, you could run away from the other and pick and choose when you fought. And because of that, the Ki-44 is going to go into A. It was also just a better plane. Okay, next up, we have the Ki-45 and the Ki-46. These are both going to go into C tier. These were As you can see, twin-engined Japanese fighters. They were very, very good in the reconnaissance role and in a variety of other roles. However, as strictly fighters, they were not able to compete against the best Allied fighters in 1939 to 1942 and would be absolutely shredded in direct air-to-air combat. So it must be noted that they did serve very successfully in a variety of other tasks. However, as strictly fighters, they were not very good. They're going to go in the C tier. Okay, next up, we have the Lag 3, and the Lag 3 is going to be our first Russian fighter of the tier list. This is also going to go into C tier. Now, the thing about the Lag was it had good flight characteristics and good handling, speed, maneuverability were all decent, and you would think maybe for those reasons it would go in B. The reason it goes in C is because it was so chronically unreliable. There was this saying in the VVS, the Russian Air Force during World War II, would you rather hunt with Dick Cheney, ride in Ted Kennedy's car, or fly a Lag? And most people would actually choose one of the first two rather than fly a Lag because this thing had a better chance of killing you than you actually killing the enemy in it. Okay, and now we have the MC200. We are going to put this, and while we're at it, let's also put the RE2000 here, another Italian fighter. These are two first-generation monoplane Italian fighters, and they both had the same problems. They had underwhelming horsepower, so they weren't very fast, and they had underwhelming armament. They only had 2 small caliber machine guns. That did not cut it for World War II. Those are going in the C tier. And now we have the Macchi MC202, the first second generation Italian monoplane of our tier list, and this is going in my Hall of Fame. This is my favorite plane of all time. And to be frank, I cannot rank it accurately because I cannot think with my brain on this plane. I'm thinking with my heart, okay? This had a license-produced Daimler-Benz 601 liquid-cooled engine in it. So you have German engineering, and of course the body, the aerodynamics of the plane were made by Italians. So you have German engineering and Italian design, a match made in heaven. I have something of a romantic affection for this plane, and so this is going in my Hall of Fame. Okay, next up we have the Nakajima A6M2N. This is going to go in F tier. As you can tell, this is a float plane, and as you'd imagine, these large tubes on the bottom of this plane that enable it to land on water don't do wonders for its aerodynamics or its performance. And so that is why it's going to go in F tier. The floats enabled, of course, this plane to have a massive range and enabled it to land on water, which greatly extended what things the Japanese could use it for, like reconnaissance in the Pacific War. But as a fighter, in air-to-air combat, this thing could not compete with non-float planes. So it's going in F. Okay, P-36. This is going to be our first decent American plane that we are going to put in B. I almost put this in the too ugly to take to prom tier because it is quite ugly, but it was a decent fighter. The French actually used it to quite a bit of success during the fall of France in May of 1940 during that campaign and the German invasion. It accounted for 1/3 of all French victories during that conflict. They bought a few hundred from the U.S. before the war began. The Finns also bought some from the United States and had great success against the Russian Air Force during the Continuation War and in 1939. So, and by all accounts, it actually handled quite well. It was somewhat underpowered, but that's enough for it to get a B. Okay, and now we have the P-38, our only twin-engine American fighter, and it's going to get an A. As an American, it's hard not to like the P-38. Like most American things, it was sturdy. It was well made. It was dependable. As you can see, it's twin engine. So one engine goes out, the other can still bring you home. And unlike a lot of American aircraft, this actually had a 20-millimeter cannon. So this thing had some serious firepower. It wasn't very maneuverable. You could not dogfight with a BF-109 in this thing, but as long as you used your speed, it had a crazy dive. You could outfight more maneuverable opponents. Also had excellent range that enabled it to be used on long-range missions like the one that killed Admiral Yamamoto in 1943. This thing, it's an icon. A lot of the best American aces flew it. It's going to go in the A tier. Okay, the P-39. We're going to put this in B tier. The Soviets actually acquired a lot of these through Lend-Lease and were the ones who enjoyed this plane the most. A lot of American pilots did not like it. The Soviets did. One reason is a lot of the air combat along the Eastern Front was at a very low altitude, and the P-39 did well at those altitudes. It did it less well at high altitudes, but that didn't matter that much where the Russians were fighting. It was also great in the ground attack role. This thing had some serious firepower, a large cannon, and could really dish out some damage. But strictly as a fighter, it was decent but not great. It's going to go in the B tier. Okay, now we have the P-40. This is going to be another A-tier American plane, the most prodigious American plane in the first few years of the war, and also one of the most underrated. This thing could take so much punishment and keep flying. There were multiple accounts of planes, of P-40s, having hundreds of bullets in them in combat, like getting absolutely shredded, still making it home. That was one of the best aspects of this plane, but also had better performance than most people give it credit for. It could turn really well at high speeds and had a pretty decent maximum speed as well. The Allison engine was problematic, and it didn't have the best handling, so it definitely can't go in S, but it's a solid A-tier fighter. Next up, we have the PZL-11, and the PZL-11 is another plane that I am too emotionally invested in to rank this properly. Now, again, if I was just going to use logic, I'd put this in the F tier because this wasn't a very good plane. But the thing is, as a Polish, and the only Polish fighter that we are going to be ranking on this tier list, it's emblematic of the people of Poland and the nation of Poland, who were betrayed countless times during World War II and still did so much to advance the Allied cause. When the Germans invaded in 1939, Britain and France had both signed an agreement with Poland that stipulated they would provide weapons and material and soldiers and invade Germany from the west if Germany launched an assault against Poland. So a mutual defense pact. And of course, when the Germans invaded Poland, both Britain and France betrayed the Poles, did not assist the Poles as they had said. Their forces did not invade Germany as a response, and they sat and twiddled their thumbs when German forces ripped Poland apart in 1939. At the end of the war, the Poles had fought alongside the Allies all 6 years of the conflict. They expected independence. Instead, what happened? The Poles had to spend another 40 years as part of the USSR. And it is just absolutely disgusting to me that Britain and the United States did not insist that the Soviets had to allow the Poles their own independent nation. It is beyond shameful how the Poles were treated in World War II. And yet, despite being betrayed, despite being conquered, despite being outmanned and outgunned during their fight against the Germans, there were many examples of Polish heroism and resistance throughout World War II. Because of the indomitable spirit of the Polish people, this is going in the Hall of Fame. Okay, next up, we have the RE-2001. The RE-2001 is going to go in the A tier. This is an Italian fighter. It was a contemporary of the MC-202. By some accounts, it was even better than the MC-202. However, the reason I'm putting it in A is because there simply weren't many of them made. And so it's hard to judge a plane that did not have many combat records. So it's going to go in A. There's a potential it even deserves to be an S, but it's going to go in A for that reason. Okay, Supermarine Spitfire. This thing, another iconic World War II plane for good reason. It's going in S. Of course, the most enduring legacy of the Supermarine Spitfire was the Battle of Britain. Never in the history of the world had so many owed so much to so few. And it is because of that legacy and this plane's remarkable characteristics, it was one of the best fighters of the Second World War, that it is going to go in S tier. And of course, it's a classic plane. Okay, we have the Yak-1 and the Yak-7. These Russian fighters are going to be the first decent ones, and they're both going to go in the A tier. These things lacked slightly in armament, and they didn't have the best handling, but they had great speed. They had great maneuverability. They were dependable. They were tough. And because of that, we're going to put them in the A tier. And then finally, the MiG-3, our last plane of the tier list. And this is going to be a Russian plane that we are going to put in C tier. This thing was really fast. However, it didn't handle very well. Its armament was sorely lacking. It had been designed as a high-altitude interceptor, but most of the combat, as I've already stated, along the Eastern Front was not at high altitude, but low altitude in support of the ground forces. Near ground level, it simply was not able to compete against German fighters like the Bf-109 or the FW-190, so it's going to go in C tier. All right, and with that being said, it looks like we have completed our tier list. I'm very confident in the emotional investment that I have on these planes at the top here, and I do think that these are the best planes that fought from 1939 to 1942 in World War II. A lot of names you'll recognize. I highly suggest looking into the FW-190 if you don't know much about that plane, because it's really cool, and also the MC-202 because it's super cool. Okay, but with that being said, I'm signing out. I'll see you guys until the next one.